Hi, I'm David Schnake. I'm the Forest Research Operations Manager with the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services. And today I'm going to be giving you a video tour focused on some of the silvicultural treatments we practice in the Sandhills region to create and maintain habitat for the federally endangered red-cockaded woodpecker. Red-cockaded woodpeckers have recently been recommended for downlisting. They are still endangered, and the protections that cover them are still very much in place. So on a lot of the public lands here in the Sandhills, which there's a lot of military bases and state-owned land in this region, that does drive a lot of the conversation of longleaf pine management among us. Many of us are trying to meet the recovery standards as outlined in the recovery plan published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Those recovery standards provide us with some fairly clear metrics of what we need to do to make sure that we are maintaining adequate habitat for red-cockaded woodpeckers. Those standards are kind of right here. I'll briefly walk through them. Really what we're kind of shooting for is maintaining a kind of minimum of about 40% ground cover of native understory vegetation. Usually we're shooting for, at least in this portion of longleaf pines native range, wiregrass. That's our big bunch grass species around here. We also have to make sure that we keep our mid-story hardwood component to a minimum. It needs to be sparse, and if present, needs to be less than about 7 feet tall. So we're meeting that here. There's turkey oak, blackjack oak, post oaks. There's even a little persimmon just right over here. All kept relatively short through the frequent use of prescribed burning. This particular site is burned about every 3 years during the growing season, but you'll see different combinations depending on the land you're on. Some landowners burn annually, some landowners burn every 5 years. Just kind of depends on what they're trying to do, as well as some of the operational limitations of using prescribed fire in an area that is experiencing some development. Pinehurst Golf Course is just a couple miles that way, if that gives you any idea. So we use frequent fire to kind of maintain this more open woodland condition. We also frequently use, commercial timber harvests and things of that sort to maintain another component of the habitat, which is kind of a minimum density of large diameter southern yellow pine trees. What you see right around you is about 50 square feet of basal area of large diameter, so over 10 inches in diameter, longleaf pine. So this is a longleaf stand, but we can also create this structure using pond pine, shortleaf pine, slash pine, loblolly pine. And as long as we kind of maintain this more open woodland structure, we actually do get occupancy by red-cockaded woodpeckers in those species. So it's a selective bird, but not that selective with regards to the other southern yellow pines. But this is a cavity tree for red-cockaded woodpecker, or for red-cockaded woodpeckers. If we were to scroll up a little bit, you'd actually see an insert, and I'll show you a picture of that here. But in general, really what we're trying to do is maintain that kind of minimum density to make sure that we're providing enough foraging area for the bird. They come in and they feed at the insects that are on the bark of these trees or beneath the bark of these trees. They also actively nest in living large diameter southern yellow pine trees. So by creating this open woodland structure, we're providing area for them to feed as well as areas for them to breed. So that's the general rundown of what we're trying to do in the recovery standards, is kind of stay within those guidelines. There's not really an upper limit to the basal area that we need to try to carry on this site, so there's no kind of ceiling that we need or that we have to stay below. We pretty much just kind of have to watch these stands and periodically remove some of the overstory trees to make sure that we're not holding too high of densities and starting to actually degrade some of the understory plant community. So if we put too much shade on the forest floor, some of this wiregrass starts to go away. That could become a problem for us. We're not meeting that kind of full suite of habitat metrics that we need to. So in today's tour, what we will focus on is getting to this point. So this is kind of the fun part and the easy part once we get to this. Once we get to this, we can frequently just keep this open and maintain through the frequent use of prescribed burning, provided fire is not overly difficult to use on a given site. Sometimes we have to come in and use some herbicides if the hardwoods get away from us, but once we get here, we're sometimes in pretty decent shape. It's getting here that can be hard, because we frequently start off with stands that have experienced decades of fire suppression and encroachment related to that fire suppression by species like loblolly pine, slash, as well as the mid-story hardwoods, which grow pretty well on these sites if you don't keep them at bay through the frequent use of prescribed fire. So we're going to take a look at some of the treatments that we use to kind of both create and then ultimately maintain this more open woodland structure. And that'll be kind of the rundown of the tour. So I hope you enjoy what you see. And if you have any questions about anything that you see, just hold on to them, and I'd be glad to try to answer them during the Q&A session. So enjoy. I mentioned during the intro video that we frequently start off in conditions that are less than ideal for the red-cockaded woodpecker, especially compared to the very nice looking stand where we shot the intro video. This is an example of that. This is a very long suppressed stand, long fire suppressed stand. We have not had fire burning through here in about 40 years. And due to that lack of fire, we have pretty immense amounts of hardwood encroachment into the mid-story layers of this stand. So if you look around, you can see we still have about 50 square feet of overstory longleaf pine basal area of large diameter trees. So we could have red-cockaded woodpecker habitat in this stand. Unfortunately, we have about 90 square feet of this mid-story hardwood, these scrub oaks. Some of this stuff is pulpwood size, some of this stuff is considered submergible. And they present a number of problems for us. A big one being they dramatically alter the light environment on the forest floor. That limits our ability to start to build up that diverse ground cover and wiregrass that we would want on these types of sites to kind of bump up our habitat score. It also limits opportunities for us to try to regenerate longleaf pine in these types of sites. So there's a number of treatments that we like to try to implement to get rid of this mid-story hardwood. The same types of treatments we would also implement to try to get rid of encroachment by pine, which you're going to see in a video in just a minute here. But there's both commercial as well as for-cost operations, commercial ones being pulpwood harvests or chip harvests, costs being things like injection or mulching operations that we frequently use to try to get rid of this mid-story layer and rebuild that kind of woodland structure and push these stands towards conditions where we might see occupancy by red-cockaded woodpeckers. So with that, I'll show you an example of pine encroachment, and then we'll move on to actually seeing some of these treatments. I just showed you a site that was experiencing hardwood encroachment due to a lack of fire. It's not always hardwoods that causes the problems down here. If there's a seed source for loblolly or slash pine nearby, those species can also seed in pretty rapidly and take over the space in those longleaf pine woodlands, particularly in the absence of fire. Now, I realize that I'm a couple hundred miles outside of the native range of slash pine, but that species was pretty extensively planted here in the Sandhills region, at least in North Carolina, in the 60s and 70s. And if you give it enough sunlight and it's on the right site, it can regenerate and grow pretty well. It doesn't necessarily love our ice and fusiform rust, but we have some pretty nice plantations of slash scattered here and there. But loblolly and slash pine and pond pine, depending on where you are, those are oftentimes the culprits that fill in the space in those longleaf pine woodlands once fire is removed from that system that would typically keep those other species at bay. Here we see the results of a mulching operation just a couple of weeks ago, so a relatively fresh job. But as you can see, most of the hardwood mid-story has been removed from this stand through that operation. The operator was also skilled enough to not grind up the longleaf pine and shortleaf pine regeneration that you might be able to see behind me. So it was a pretty skilled operator working on this job, which was very fortunate. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is if we lift down right in front, there's a couple of patches of wiregrass, and the operator was further trained to identify this and make sure that he did not dig the teeth of that fekin head grinder into the ground and disturb this. Again, this is another part of kind of the set of metrics that we have to shoot for to create that red-cockaded woodpecker foraging habitat. But as you can see, this is a pretty effective way to rapidly change the conditions in these types of long suppressed longleaf pine stands and drive them towards those conditions that would facilitate red-cockaded woodpecker occupancy. This particular operation, because it was a mulching job, this actually cost money. So this was about $500 an acre, although I will say NRCS is covering that cost. So private landowners actually do have some access to these types of operations, and they are affordable if you can find that type of assistance. But certain times of the year here in the Sandhills, particularly during the kind of wetter winter months, we have access to a pellet industry around here, where we oftentimes can have this mid-story hardwood commercially harvested and ground up into chips and further processed into wood pellets, which are then later on sold over in Europe to kind of meet some of their climate change regulations. But for the most part, it just kind of depends on, honestly, you just kind of have to get lucky. Sometimes that chip market is there, other times these types of things are costs. A lot of us who manage operationally down here will sit on these sites until we hear that the chip market is active, and then we'll unload them. But for other people with other objectives, and particularly people that are getting some type of cost share assistance, these types of operations can pretty much happen year-round down here and are fairly common. Just a real quick video of the cutter operator cleaning out some mid-story hardwoods. While the mulching operation can be very effective at rapidly changing the conditions in these stands and driving them towards red-cockaded woodpecker habitat, they're certainly not a silver bullet. If we look at this site, so where we were then, I'm filming these in October. That was harvested, that was mulched just a couple of weeks ago. This was mulched back in June, and as you can see, a lot of the hardwood that was ground up, in fact, most of the hardwood that the mulcher took care of, has just sprouted back. And that can be a problem. It sprouts back pretty vigorously, as you would expect, you know, a 6-inch diameter oak tree to sprout. Now, we have tried various things to try to control this. We've tried different herbicides like triclopyr applied to the stump. We've tried hexazinone on some of these sites too, the old power pellets, if any of you remember that. We also will sometimes come into these sites and just bring in prescribed fire to try to control them. But each one of them kind of has its pros and cons. We have not found triclopyr to be all that effective, and that is usually the chemical that we want to spray because it's not as, it doesn't damage the wiregrass and other grass species that we want to maintain on this site. Hexazinone is quite effective, but we are on very deep sands here. You know, longleaf pine is tolerant of those types of conditions, but hexazinone still affects the species. And we've run into situations where when we start coupling prescribed burning with hexazinone, with some of these harvest operations, it just puts a lot of stress on these stands and we start losing overstory. That's a problem for us. We've tried imazapyr and run into issues with contractors not being very careful with it and dropping too much of that hot mix of imazapyr when they're treating the stumps. And that's just a bunch of imazapyr in your soil, and that also takes out our overstory. So it kind of depends on the site what the proper treatment needs to be. Prescribed burning is also very effective, and we try that on sites. This site has not been burned yet, but we also have to be careful with prescribed burning. I'm standing next to this really old, inactive red-cockaded woodpecker cavity tree. That's why it's not white banded, it's not currently active. But let's just look at the base of this tree. The site hasn't been burned in at least 30 or 40 years. If you start digging through here, we can get down over a foot before we actually hit sand on this site. The duff has accumulated around the base of this tree. A lot of the fine roots have started to grow up into that duff. And unfortunately, we've learned the hard way on a lot of sites that if you just reintroduce fire to these sites and you're not really careful about it, that'll sit there and smolder and kill this tree. So what we do now is we will come in after it rained and over the period of, you know, a decade or more, just slowly burn away at that duff layer, give the roots an opportunity to kind of retreat, and then eventually get down to bare mineral soil, and then we can move into more aggressive burning. So a lot of dormant season work to kind of whittle away at this duff layer is necessary before we can really start to reintroduce an aggressive fire regime back into these stands and start to build up our understory species and control that oak. In a previous video, I talked about the risks of having too aggressive of a fire too soon in some of these long suppressed longleaf pine stands, and this is an example of that. Prior to a wildfire burning through this recently harvested site, the duff was probably sitting at about this level on this tree. You kind of slope down from here. And then, you know, once the wildfire burned through here, a lot of these trees just continued to smolder. In fact, just a little bit over there, there's actually still some trees smoldering, and the fire was a week ago. Anyway, it reduced a lot of the duff, and unfortunately for a lot of these older mature trees, a lot of the fine roots had grown up into that duff layer, and we're expecting pretty high levels of mortality among these mature overstory trees that unfortunately just had a fire come in before we had an opportunity to, over the course of a couple of decades, or at least a decade, burn during the dormant season during wet conditions and slowly kind of burn away at that layer. So this is just an example of kind of what this looks like if you end up with a fire that comes in a little bit too soon into these long suppressed stands. We've just seen some examples of stands we come into that maybe have some hardwood or some pine encroachment, and how we kind of steer those towards the structural conditions and compositions we want for red-cockaded woodpecker habitat creation and maintenance. Sometimes we start off with plantations. NRCS funding, work by groups like Longleaf Alliance, America's Longleaf, North Carolina Forest Service here locally have done a really good job of getting a lot of landowners to establish these longleaf pine plantations, many of them on old fields. Like, for example, this one is on an old Bermuda grass field. It's about a 25-year-old stand that was planted with bare root longleaf pine. We didn't even have containerized stock back then. So if you notice, the trees are not very nice looking. These are not the best genetics. We have better stuff now. But this is a starting point that a lot of us have. And there's nothing really wrong with this, but we also are now looking at ways to kind of steer these high density longleaf pine plantations towards the structures that would be more conducive to hosting red-cockaded woodpeckers. But before we do that, I want to put a plug in for some of these plantations. These are a really good way for a landowner to make a decent amount of money early on before transitioning their stands to that more open structure that doesn't have the same economic benefits that we might see if we carried higher basal areas than what's recommended within the RCW guidelines. And the big money maker, if we just look down in a lot of these stands, is pine straw. For some of you not from the Southeast, that might come as a little bit of a shock, but this is a product that we sell quite a bit of. And in a relatively high density plantation like this, I know this because this is one of my plantations and I sell the straw off of it every once in a while. I can produce about 150 bales, square bales, which there will be a picture inset of what a square bale looks like, of this stuff every year, usually harvested every other year. So I produce about 300 bales per acre for my harvest, and I sell that stuff lump sum. Typically get about $1 a bale out of it is usually what it averages out to. So, $300 an acre every other year from these plantations. Can usually start doing it when they hit crown closure, which relatively young. This stand hit it at about age 11. So we've been doing it for a while, making a decent amount of money off of the stand. And once we get to a point where, we are interested in doing some density management in these stands and opening them up, we do. But in that kind of intermediate time frame, pine straw management is something that we do. And there's various people down here trying different ways to kind of transition these plantations to a more natural looking environment and structure and composition that is better habitat for the red-cockaded woodpeckers, and we're going to see some of that now. When we start off with a plantation, oftentimes the first practice that we implement in there is a commercial thinning operation to reduce the basal area in that stand and put a little bit more sunlight on the forest floor to help develop our understory vegetation and accelerate the growth of our residual overstory trees to get them into those size classes that are more usable by red-cockaded woodpeckers. This is an example of a pretty traditional commercial thinning operation as practiced down here in the Southeast. The way the operator did this one is oftentimes there's a third or a fourth row thin, meaning they'll take out every third or every fourth row and then they'll selectively pick out trees off the sides of the rows. In this operation, the harvester took every other 2 rows. So harvested 2 rows, skipped 2 rows, harvested 2 rows, skipped 2 rows, and then commercially thinned or selectively thinned off of either side of the corridor. and that reduced the basal area in this stand from about 140 square feet per acre down to about 50 square feet per acre. But as you can see, the crowns on these trees are actually still pretty good, so you know, we're hopeful that they will respond. But as you can see, there's this corridor that kind of runs through here, and some of us on public lands are trying to move away from leaving these pretty obvious corridors, and trying various techniques to just kind of change the visual impacts of some of these thinning operations and not leave these kind of geometric patterns out here, and just add a little bit more heterogeneity to those stands following those thinning operations to better resemble some of the stand conditions that we find in more naturally occurring longleaf pine stands. And we are going to see an example of that now. In the previous video, we saw a stand that had been thinned kind of using a more traditional row thinning approach that's pretty common down here in the southeast. This is an example of a little bit different of an approach. It's kind of our variation on a variable density thinning, at least to the degree that we could actually talk a logger into doing that type of thing. If you want to see the structure that I'm talking about, just go ahead and check out the inset video that will be playing kind of in the bottom corner of this. That'll give you an idea, you know, shot with a drone of kind of what this looked like. But the way we handled that thinning is the operator came in and did kind of approach it as a normal, you know, traditional row thinning to begin with. Instead of having them cut down the rows, though, we actually had them kind of cut across the rows. So just taking that kind of preliminary step made this a little bit less of a geometric arrangement than we would have if we would have just done a traditional row thinning. Once the logger had kind of finished up thinning it to our initial target, which was, you know, right around 70 square feet of basal area, we then had them come back into this site and go back down those rows and thin pretty heavily up and down them, and also identified some areas where they could thin to as low as 40 square feet of basal area. And then there were some skip areas. We had them kind of reduce those down to closer to like 90. That's kind of our high end. We had some higher end, some higher basal area retention areas, but we've since thinned those back. It's not a great idea for us to hold basal areas a whole lot higher than that here. With these deep sands, and when we reintroduce fire, we run into beetle problems. So anyway, it was one of those things where, you know, we did the initial traditional harvest and then had the logger come back and open up the stand more in some areas and keep densities higher in others. So it kind of left a variable density across the site. And we also had them create some gaps periodically, not huge ones. In the video that is the kind of the aerial image, I don't think I really capture any gaps in that one. A lot of those are down that direction, which is a little too close to a prison for me to fly a drone. But anyway, that's kind of just a different approach. It ended up working out well for us. The logger really kind of appreciated doing that extra thinning, mainly because these sandhill sites, they're dry, even when it rains. So in the winter time, for example, when the swampy part of eastern North Carolina is too wet to operate with heavy equipment, loggers oftentimes will pay a premium for access to these sandhill sites, and we were able to take advantage of that for this particular harvest. So this is just, I guess, another way that we've tried to take these plantations, which are pretty plentiful down here, and transition them to a more natural structure that might be more conducive to occupancy from red-cockaded woodpeckers. So far, we've seen hardwood encroachment in mature stands, young pine encroachment in mature stands, and plantations. This is following treatment of a stand that was in a different condition, which was about a 120-year-old stand of longleaf and shortleaf pine. We know they're the same age because we cored them, and it kind of makes sense that they'd be the same age given their, you know, general fire tolerance. But there was about a 70-year-old cohort of loblolly pine that had moved onto this site following fire suppression, and it grew pretty rapidly. So the stand was functioning as kind of a very high density, even age stand. Prior to treatment, we were looking at about 160 to 170 square feet of overstory basal area. So not open conditions, not meeting our objectives for red-cockaded woodpecker. To remedy that, while also staying within the guidelines of the recovery standards, we decided to come in and remove the loblolly pine and retain between 0 and 80 square feet of basal area per acre of longleaf and shortleaf pine, with the occasional large diameter hardwood left out here for mass production. We deliberately made sure that the densities kind of varied across that site within that range of 0 to 80 to give us that average of 40 square feet of basal area, which keeps us in compliance with the woodpecker recovery guidelines. If I could go back and do this over again, I would have left more. We've had some lightning strikes, we've had some wind throw, and we had a wildfire come through part of the stand. So we've lost some overstories, so there are portions of it right now where we're likely not kind of meeting that minimum threshold or that minimum basal area of 40 square feet. As far as future management of this stand goes, the plan is to slowly reintroduce fire to this stand. Again, we're still facing that buildup of duff around the base of these trees. Slowly reintroduce prescribed fire to it. And then also, some of the gaps are so big that I'm not confident that we are going to catch adequate regeneration of longleaf pine. We might get some shortleaf in there, but longleaf seed doesn't exactly glide that well. It's fairly large. So what we'll actually end up doing is coming in and underplanting at a relatively low density. We do that, we've done that on other sites on the property, underplanted about 150 containerized longleaf seedlings per acre. And that's been pretty successful in securing some regeneration and being sufficient enough to prove that we have potentially suitable habitat for red-cockaded woodpeckers if we allow the stand to develop over time. So with that, we'll turn this off and actually just go take a look at another stand where we have actually done that underplanting work so you can see the results. All right, this is the final stop, and we are standing in what was about a 120-year-old stand of longleaf pine. The overstory prior to a variety of things that happened out here was pushing about 80 to 90 square feet of overstory of large diameter longleaf pine. We did have red-cockaded woodpeckers in this stand. In fact, there still are some. You can hear one chirping right over there. But we came in and we did some brush saw work in this stand to control kind of an out-of-control mid-story hardwood that was developing. You can hear the road behind me. That's Highway 211. It's busy. It's very difficult for us to burn this stand, so the hardwood oftentimes gets away from us. We came in, we did brush saw work, followed by a cut stump application of triclopyr. It was not that successful. Most of the hardwood just sprouted back, and that's the hardwood you can kind of see around me here. We came in and did a prescribed burn about a year after we did the mid-story removal work, and unfortunately we had a very unfortunate shift in weather on that burn day. The temperature shifted, the humidity dropped, and the wind changed direction on us. We got caught in that fire. It burned way too hot in here. Fort Bragg had a hot fire that day. State Parks had hot fire. A bunch of us thought it was a good day. It wasn't a good day. And we ended up burning so hot that we ended up kind of drawing in a fairly healthy population of both ips and black turpentine beetles. And it kind of ran through the stand. To try to sanitize the situation, we worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and determined that kind of the way forward, given that there were woodpeckers in this stand, was to come in and basically retain the bare minimum for the RCW recovery standards, which was 40 square feet of overstory basal area of large diameter trees. So we removed everything but that. Unfortunately, beetles kept rolling through the stand. Lightning happened, wind happened. We lost it, and now we ended up sitting a little closer to like seed tree level retention levels, like 10 to 20 square feet of basal area per acre. So to overcome the fact that we didn't really have uniform distribution of longleaf across this site, to start to regenerate it, we came in and we did an underplanting. We underplanted about 150 containerized longleaf pine trees per acre, and allowed those to kind of develop with the natural regeneration that occurred both after the harvest as well as dropping in from the residual trees. And since then, we've just burned it twice. So that's kind of how we're trying to manage it forward, is when we have favorable weather and we can burn without smoking out the highway, we burn through here. Last one came through about a week ago. I just wanted to show you the results. So this is a rocketing longleaf pine seedling. You can see the fire got hot enough to brown this out, but if you look hard, the green needles around the top and the bud are still protected. So that kind of helps insulate that bud and keep it from getting too hot. This tree is likely to make it through the fire. And actually, if you look at almost all of our longleaf pine out here, most of it, while brown, still has green towards the top. So it's a very tough species when it comes to those types of things. That's one of its adaptations to being able to kind of exist in these frequent fire systems. So that's kind of how we're going to manage this forward, is just periodically burn to try to keep the hardwood at bay. and hopefully kind of continue to build up additional regeneration of longleaf pine in this stand and get it back to red-cockaded woodpecker habitat. That's all I had. There's obviously a lot more to managing longleaf pine. You don't always have to just manage it for red-cockaded woodpeckers. I just focused on it because I had limited time, and it happens to be the aspect of longleaf pine management that I have the most experience with. So I hope you got something out of this. I enjoyed it. I've been a little crazy lately, so this has actually been kind of a nice break to get out here and put these videos together. So with that, I'll take any of your questions during the Q&A session, and if I don't get to you, just send me an email or give me a call. I'm not terribly hard to track down, and I'm chatty. So if you want to ask questions or chat about any of this, feel free to get a hold of me.